So let's dive right into this, because at first glance, the story we're unpacking today sounds like a classic tale of digital data just vanishing into the ether. But actually, that is not what happened here. Welcome to our explainer on an absolute modern tech mystery, where decades of priceless public television history got entirely locked away from the exact people who created it. We're talking about the hidden, often ignored vulnerabilities of modern storage, and how it's entirely possible to legally own a massive vault of your own digital property and yet find yourself completely unable to touch it.
70 years. Just wrap your head around that time frame for a second. Imagine spending 7 decades building a comprehensive archive of your organization's entire history. That's exactly what 9 PBS, a public television station in the St. Louis area, did. Over 70 years, they meticulously compiled a sprawling archive of roughly 50 terabytes of material. It's this enormous digital footprint representing literal generations of local history, news footage, and documentaries. And then, completely out of nowhere in 2026, boom! They lost all ability to reach it.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the core paradox staring us right in the face. Just because data exists doesn't mean access exists. There is zero evidence showing that 9 PBS's archive was destroyed. The files didn't get wiped out in some catastrophic server fire or a massive hack. In fact, they were reportedly sitting completely safe and sound inside a physical data center in Denver. The problem was 100% about access. The data was sitting right there, but the digital doors were firmly, stubbornly shut.
To really grasp what's at stake here, we have to look at the immense cultural and historical value of this archive. We aren't just talking about a folder of old emails and disposable files. According to the lawsuit reporting, this 50-terabyte vault contained over 11,000 individual files of absolutely irreplaceable history. We're talking critical on-the-ground coverage of the Great Flood of 1993, the rich documented history of East St. Louis, and incredibly extensive local coverage of the COVID-19 pandemic. Losing access to this didn't just mean losing data, it meant losing the visual memory of an entire region.
So, how does an archive like that actually get locked away? Well, let's break down the infrastructure, because you really have to think of this arrangement in 3 distinct layers to see how the chain of custody works. First, up at the top, you have 9 PBS. They are the content owners. Second, sitting in the middle, you have open source storage, or OSS. They're the storage service provider that 9 PBS directly hired. And third, at the foundational base layer, we have Iron Mountain. They operate the physical data center environment in Denver where OSS's actual physical equipment lives. Sounds like a totally straightforward business setup, right? Well, until a critical piece right in the middle suddenly breaks.
And break it dead. 9 PBS says their agreement with OSS was supposed to give them a grace period to retrieve their data if the contract was ever terminated, but according to the legal complaint around March 6th, right when the contract expired, access was just abruptly cut off. 9 PBS frantically tried to communicate with OSS, but nobody answered. They quickly discovered that their storage provider, OSS, appeared to have simply stopped operating altogether and was officially listed as delinquent with Colorado authorities. The middleman had literally vanished into thin air.
Which brings us to one of the most important reality checks in this whole explainer. When people hear a phrase like cloud storage, we are totally conditioned to imagine our files magically floating around seamlessly in some giant invisible digital sky. But guys, the cloud is kind of an illusion. Ultimately, every single piece of data has to live on physical hardware somewhere. It relies on tangible, heavy servers, spinning hard drives, physical network cables, and massive power cords plugged into concrete buildings. In this specific case, an Iron Mountain facility in Denver.
So, the crucial point is figuring out the dilemma Iron Mountain was suddenly facing. The question wasn't who owns the files. 9 PBS legally owned them, no question there. The real question was who is legally and technically allowed to physically touch the hardware. You see, Iron Mountain stated their relationship was with the middleman, OSS, not directly with 9 PBS. Plus, Iron Mountain doesn't have software-level access to the actual data stored on their customers' hardware. So simply pulling out a server and handing it over without proper authorization, that could massively expose the sensitive private information of entirely different OSS customers who happen to be sharing that exact same hardware.
With the middleman completely ghosting them, 9 PBS had to act, and act fast. Access was initially cut off in March, and by July 28th, 9 PBS formally filed a lawsuit in Denver against Iron Mountain. Now keep in mind, this wasn't just them demanding their files back, it was a desperate, urgent move for preservation. They needed a judge to legally protect that data from being randomly deleted or overwritten while this entire mess got sorted out. And luckily, on August 12th, the judge came down with a pivotal ruling.
Denver District Court Judge Eric Elliff ruled that yes, 9 PBS was indeed the rightful owner.
But, and this is a big but, he didn't just order Iron Mountain to casually hand over a hard drive. He mandated a highly controlled court-ordered retrieval framework. It was a very nuanced process. Nine PBS was given a strict 30-day timeline to identify a qualified third-party vendor capable of extracting the data safely. The court even allowed for the possibility of bringing in someone intimately familiar with OS's old infrastructure, like a former employee. Most critically, this whole extraction process required very strict data privacy safeguards. The judge had to ensure absolutely no other OSS customers had their data accidentally compromised during this rescue mission.
This ruling perfectly encapsulates the immense, often frustrating difference between legally owning your data and physically being able to access it. Iron Mountain provides the physical infrastructure, right? The building, the power, the massive cooling systems. They don't act as the software-level owner of the ones and zeros inside those blinking servers. It's not like they had a giant folder labeled 9 PBS on a desktop somewhere that they could just drag and drop onto a thumb drive for the court. Cloud storage doesn't magically eliminate physical infrastructure. It just outsources the complexity of access to someone else.
And this is exactly where this explainer stops being just a fascinating story about a local television station and morphs into a vital, flashing warning light for absolutely anyone who relies on the cloud. Put yourself in their shoes for a second. Imagine your organization storing vital financial records, sensitive medical information, or literally decades of hard-earned intellectual property. What actually happens when the company providing that storage just goes under? Your files might physically exist in a rack somewhere, but if your vendor fails, do you really have the hardware, the admin credentials, or the technical means to actually get them back?
And this brilliantly illustrates the hidden, often totally overlooked economics of digital infrastructure. Notice the third step required by the judge's framework. Even after proving legal ownership, and even after figuring out how to technically recover the files, 9 PBS is still required to pay current and past due storage fees. Because OSS stopped paying Iron Mountain, those bills piled up, and they have to be covered before the actual data extraction can even happen. It's a harsh reality. Sometimes the most expensive part of a data strategy isn't storing your files. It's paying the logistical ransom to get them back out when a partnership goes south.
So, let's map out exactly where things stand right now. Because winning in court, that is only half the battle. In the bull case scenario, the hardware is totally intact, there are zero software hiccups, and the archive gets smoothly transferred and preserved. The base case, which is basically where we are right now, acknowledges that, sure, legal access is secured, but the technical extraction still has to actually happen step by step. But the scenario we really have to sweat over is the bear case. What if the data rescue hits massive technical brick walls? What if there's specialized encryption they can't easily break, or the hardware itself is corrupted over time? If that happens, the recovery could be severely delayed, or worse, permanently incomplete.
So the absolutely crucial takeaway here for any organization isn't to just panic and run away from cloud storage. That's not realistic. The lesson is that you cannot confuse outsourcing your storage with outsourcing your ultimate responsibility. Every serious business needs a rigorous data exit plan. You need independent secondary backups. You need restoration procedures that you have actually sat down and tested. Your contracts absolutely must have crystal clear data ownership provisions. But most importantly, you have to ask yourself the hard question. If our primary vendor literally disappears tomorrow, do we have the in-house capabilities, or at least a clear roadmap, to retrieve our own data ourselves?
We talk about data in the modern economy like it's this weightless, magical force. But fundamentally, it is grounded in cold, hard reality. Your data relies on a massive, highly interconnected chain of dependencies. Servers, constant power, cooling systems, specialized software, network connectivity, security credentials, and legally binding contracts. That is a lot of links. And if you remove just one single link from that chain, like, say, an expired contract or a single missing master password, your access completely and totally breaks down.
Which means the absolute most important number in this entire explainer isn't the 70 years of history, and it's not the 50 terabytes of massive storage. It is 0. Because if you lack a working, fully tested recovery path, an enormous vault of priceless historical data practically reduces to a value of exactly 0.
The 9 PBS archive wasn't wiped out. The organization simply lost practical access to something they entirely owned. In the modern cloud era, data destruction and access loss are two very different but equally devastating problems. So I'm going to leave you with this final thought to consider about your own digital life and your organizational strategy. How much is your data really worth if you can't access it?